Oh,
I
sure.
know you can't, but we
Oh,
all
there we
can.
go. All right, very nice. So,
Fabulous.
so
Good. So let us start with our blessing over our Haftarah and all of the beauties and riches of our Jewish tradition. Yada da 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 da. Yada da 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 da. Yada da da yada da da da. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu לעסוק בדברי תורה, לעסוק בדברי תורה, הפוך בה, לעסוק בדברי תורה. ידע-די-די-די-די-די, 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 ידע-די-די-די-די. So good to see everyone. This is such a nice group today. So here we go. Expand it a little bit. Can everyone see this okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes? Awesome. Actually, I'm going to make it just a little bit bigger. Make that even a little easier. So this week, our Torah portion is Vayeshev, and we're going to go actually, the Haftarah this week. Last week we did the Sephardic one, so I could throw Obadiah in there. This week our portion is actually the same for Ashkenazi and Sephardi, so that makes it pretty easy. And we're going to be looking at Amos, who is one of my favorite prophets. I think he's kind of fun to read. But first, I want to give us a little bit of context. And if you have any questions or anything you want to bring in, feel free to do so. So remember how we discussed that there are like the major classic prophets, and that's, I don't know if you can hear all the noise outside. Sorry about that. So we have those major prophets at the beginning, that has like Kings and Joshua and all of that. And then we come to the 12 prophets, and this is the third of those books. We had discussed how the 12 minor prophets are in order sequentially. And so this is one of the earlier ones. So Amos is thought to have prophesied in the 8th century BCE during the reigns of Jeroboam II of Israel and King Uzziah of Judah. And there's a few different reasons that that time period was thought of, and they actually have to do with natural events that were going on, which is kind of interesting that there is actually a reference to an earthquake that took place around 760 BC. And there's also a reference to a solar eclipse that took place, and we have the exact date, which I think is pretty amazing, June 15th, 763 BCE. And because of those references, it gives us a starting point of when he was prophesying. Within Amos, which is fairly long, he describes himself as a sheep breeder, as a cattle breeder, a tender of sycamore figs, and as someone from a hometown called Tekoa, which we think was in the wilderness of Judah in the south, even though a lot of his prophecy, as we'll see, is based on the north. So any questions or anything you want to bring in here that you know about Amos? All right, then I'll bring in just a little bit more. I think it's helpful to have this context as we're reading through it. So King Jeroboam came to power in the northern kingdom as Assyria's control over Asia was waning. And he really used the opportunity that he said, okay, I want to expand my power. I want to expand my wealth. Here is a vacancy. I'm going to go into that void and I'm going to use this to make the most of it. And other people did the same. King Uzziah also kind of came into power under similar circumstances. But one of the things that will come out is that there were people who were using this to their advantage, but there wasn't necessarily very much thought about people who were at a disadvantage and the need to protect people. And we'll see that within the text of Amos, both this week and also in the future when we look at Amos separately. What's kind of interesting about Amos is that it is one of the very first prophets whose words were preserved in writing. That a lot of our tradition was an oral tradition. And this is one of the first things that was actually written down. And there's three main sections of the book of Amos. One is oracles of doom, which sounds, this is the wording of Michael Fishbane within his Haftarah commentary over here. That's where this wording is coming from. But he explains that there's oracles of doom against foreign nations, which is actually a literary technique we've seen in different prophets, then oracles of doom against Judah and Israel, and then finally oracles of hope for Israel and Judah. You'll notice that that part is a little bit smaller. This second part makes up the vast majority of the book of Amos, and that's exactly where we are today. So we are beginning with Amos chapter 2, starting with verse 6. Any questions or anything before we jump into our text? Okay. Great, just making sure. Well, then would anyone like to read this in the English, these verses?
Sure, I will.
Thank you.
Thus said the Lord, the transgressions of Israel, wherefore I will not revoke it, because they have sold for silver those whose cause was just, and the needy for a pair of sandals. You who trample the heads of the poor into the dust of the ground and make the humble walk a twisted course. Father and son go to the same girl and thereby profane my holy name. They recline by every altar on garments taken in pledge and drink in the house of their God, wine fall with fines imposed.
Okay, so thank you so much for reading that. What do we make of this text here? Is there anything that stands out to us?
Well, that 3:1 is kind of interesting. Does that mean that 3 transgressions will be forgiven, but the 4th, if there's another one, it won't?
Great question. And actually, I have a couple of texts to that. That we're going to go to. So this is actually a rhetorical device that comes up in prophets in different places, but Amos is definitely among those who are famous for it. And what you suggest, Jessica, could be part of that. And we'll see more of that as we look at a few other texts that speak to it. But thank you for asking that question. Anything else that stand out, or does anyone else want to respond to what Jessica said?
Well, definitely you can see the they pretty much describe the failings of the people, selling silver just for a pair for the needy for a pair of sandals, and reclining and drinking in the holy house. Again, it's just a reminder that our fellow human beings were that. They were human beings. They were just as flawed as we all are.
Yeah, and what you're pointing out, Jay, is actually really, really important with Amos too. Some of our prophets, as we've seen, have been really concerned about religious matters, right? Why are you praying to other gods? Why aren't you being true to our God? And that's come up in a lot of places. It came up a lot in Isaiah and so on. But here, Amos is very much worried about issues around morality. Yes, Steve, you want to say something?
Aren't some of these things he's referring to specific, what the Canaanites did, we were specifically prohibited from doing because the Canaanites did them?
Yeah, that's one of the readings of them. Depending on which one, that's true. And there's other pieces to them as well.
Father and son go to the same girl. Wasn't that a Canaanite thing? Even in their temples.
Yeah. I don't know necessarily about something like the needy for a pair of sandals. That wasn't necessarily specific to another people, right? But that one in particular, we have like a coming together. What does it mean to be a moral and ethical Israelite? Amos, like those are the questions that are at the fore in Amos's writings. So let's go down a little bit, because I want to be able to explore a couple things based on the question that Jessica asked just a little while ago. Okay, so as we think about this X+1 device being used here for 3 transgressions of Israel, for 4, I will not revoke it, right? Let's think about that as we look at some of the text from this week's Torah portion. So there's 2 texts I'm going to bring in, and I'm doing them out of order, but I'm doing them on purpose that way. And one is the story about Judah and Tamar. Would anyone like to read this text or some of this text out loud?
Sure.
Okay, Jay, go ahead, and then Steve, when we need another reader, I'll call on you, okay?
So about that time, Judah left his brothers and camped near a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. Then Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he took her into his household as wife and cohabitated with her. She conceived and bore a son, and he named him She conceived again and bore another son and named him Onan. Once again, she bore him a son and named him Shelah. He was at Chezib when she bore him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was displeasing to God, and God took his life. So Judah said to Onan, join with your brother's wife and do your duty by her as a brother-in-law and provide offspring for your brother. But Onan, knowing that the offspring would not count as his, let the semen go to waste. Well, whenever he joined his wife, he joined with his brother's wife, so not as to provide offspring for his brother. I don't know if I read that made it sound weird or what.
Yeah, no, that's exactly where we were.
Okay. What he did was displeasing to Adonai, who took his life also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, stay as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up, for he thought he might die too, like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. A long time afterwards, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. When the period of mourning was over, Judah went to Timnah to his sheep shearers, together with his friend Hira the Adullamite. And Tamar was told, your father-in-law is coming up to Timnah for the sheep shearing.
Okay, so I'm just going to pause for a second right here because this is a long text, okay? So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So what happens? There are all of these different sons that Judah has, right? A lot of different sons. And what happened is there's this, so Tamar had married one of them, but he died, and then was married to another one because that's what was done there, and he died, and then was married to another one and he died. And so there's the situation where she couldn't do anything. She was kind of stuck right here, like waiting for someone else, another son, to be able to marry, and Judah really didn't want to help because he was afraid for his son, right? So what ends up happening? Well, Tamar is completely stuck, so she decides to, as we have right here in the text, right? She took off her widow's garb, covered her face with a veil, wrapping herself up, sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. She saw that Sheila was grown up, yet she had not been given to him as a wife because Judah is fearful that he too will die. And when Judah saw her, he took her for a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, "Here, let me sleep with you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. "What," she asked, "will you pay for sleeping with me?" He says, "I will send a kid from my flock." But she said, "You must leave a pledge until you have sent it." And he said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your seal and cord, the staff which you carry." So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she conceived by him. So she ends up having a child. Yes, Steve, did you want to say something?
No, I love the story.
So, I mean, what does the story kind of teach us? There's more to it that comes right after this, where she basically has the seal and cord, and it says, like, this is the child of the person whose seal and cord it is. And then all of a sudden, Judah has this moment of, oh, shoot, that was me. Oh, that's what happened. And then he realized that he had driven her to do this, and he takes responsibility for his actions. So it's really kind of a fascinating story in a lot of ways, and a little bit disturbing. But any comments or thoughts on this?
Is this the father and son go to the same girl issue that Amos talks about
Yeah, it is.
in verse 7, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's right. 7 or 8. I think you're right that it is 7. Yeah, it is 7.
What always amazes me is I think to myself, even if I've got the veil on, would she be able to see that it was Judith? And did she know? Did she know
knew.
she was?
He
Yeah.
knew, but he
Yeah.
didn't.
She was totally aware of what was happening and what she was doing. She was just stuck. Like, she was in a holding place where, you know, as a widow who is waiting on marrying this other son, right? She is totally stuck. She is totally vulnerable, and there's nothing she can do. And after waiting for so long, she said, okay, this is what I have to do. I have to take matters into my hands.
So
was there an obligation to marry another son? And
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's exactly what the obligation was. Misty, go ahead.
yeah, I was I had to unmute. I was going to say there's a sense of justice. You know, like, you know, she did everything she was supposed to do, and as a female in a very patriarchal society and the culture of that time, she really had no other options. She couldn't get married. She was just sitting there in her father's house, and they're probably looking down at her along with the neighbors because she wasn't able to provide an offspring. And so she gets her justice in the end. And Judah failed at what he was tasked to do. I mean, he was one of Joseph's brother, right? When we think of Joseph, and that family and those brothers already had a mark against them for what they did with Joseph. And here you are again. Now you're in a leadership position, and this is what you're doing. So payback.
Doesn't Tamara have to have a baby because she is in the line of King David?
Well, she didn't know that.
I know she doesn't know that, but we know that, so we know the story.
But this tradition that persisted until relatively recent times, that when a spouse dies, the family is obligated to provide the next eligible person to take their place.
Right.
In my genealogical research, I found this several times in my own family, as recently as my great grandparents.
Mhm.
Both sides of my family were subject to this problem or situation, what do you want to call it?
Yeah, this was definitely normative at this time.
You know, but marrying this woman is almost like a fast track to an early death, with 3 of her previous husbands dying.
Well, I mean, that's what Judah's concern was, is maybe this woman is cursed. Maybe there's something wrong
can
here.
you blame him? I'd be thinking about that.
God knows.
Well, 3 is too small a sample set. Michael.
Oh, I see.
If it had been 30, maybe.
Oh, I see.
But I mean, actually, this raises a really important question. And Michael, I'm not putting any words in your mouth here at all, because I know this is not what you're saying. But like within society at large, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes when bad things happen to people, there is a trend and has been a trend of millennia to blame the victim. Like, oh, there must be something wrong with you that something bad has happened. I want to keep my distance from you. Whereas our Jewish tradition tells us to do the exact opposite, that if someone is in need, we need to be there for them. And so this is when those ideals are really being put to the test. And Judah made the wrong call, but then eventually really takes responsibility for his actions.
Yeah, I know. Okay.
So this is an important piece to keep in mind, right? If we're thinking about the 3 and 1, what does that say? Right? Like sometimes we make terrible mistakes and we do the wrong thing. And sometimes there's a way back from that. But perhaps sometimes there isn't. And so I want to take us to the next text. And this, like I said, actually happened before the story of Tamar. And I'm including just a small piece of it right here. Steve, do you want to read this?
Fine. When Midianites traders passed by, they pulled Joseph up out of the pit. They sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites who brought Joseph to Egypt.
Okay, so what's the wrong that's being done here? What's going on with this verse and before it?
Well, that's slavery. That's selling someone into slavery, which is certainly wrong.
Mhm.
Well,
But in this case here, the alternative was his brothers were plotting to kill him until Reuben stepped in and said, no, let's not kill him, just sell him instead.
Right. Yeah. So that's also fairly problematic, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot that's going on here that is not just at all. One other piece that I want to point out here, by the way, is we talked earlier. Let me just get to that verse so you can see it. Sorry if this is making anyone dizzy. Okay, so here's the words that we had within our first verse, right? Because they have sold for silver those whose cause was just and the needy for a pair of sandals. Okay, well, hold on to that. Now we go down to this verse, right? They sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver. Okay, so it's talking about, where are our values? Is it in riches or is it in how we treat one another? And actually, there's this fascinating text that I came upon, and this comes from the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, and it's the testament of Zebulun, which is the 6th son. And it says, but Simeon and Gad and 6 other of our brethren took the price of Joseph and bought sandals for themselves, their wives, and their children, saying, we will not eat of it, for it is the price of our brother's blood. So we actually have a reference to sandals in this text, which of course is going back to our Haftarah for today. So what do you make of the message of that?
Fascinating how they're intertwined.
Yeah.
what is we will not eat of it? What is that? Literally, they won't buy food for it, or is there some other?
Well, clearly they had some guilt about the money that they had received for selling their brother, right? And they didn't want to benefit of it. That actually goes back to some other midrashim that I didn't put in here. So the other piece of the story about Jacob or about Joseph was that they threw him into the pit and then they sat outside of the pit eating and drinking. And a lot of the midrashim say, and I think I've mentioned this before, that by eating and enjoying that as their brother was suffering is one of the most clear examples of just heartlessness. And so like they have guilt around that. And that's that's piece that's coming out here.
But they didn't do the selling. The Midianites sold him. They
Well, that-
dumped him in. Isn't that right?
No, they did. They sold him.
Oh, okay.
But
Or the
that,
Midianites resold him.
Yeah, he was resold.
Was there a
Yeah.
markup each time?
You know,
Irv,
to
go
me,
ahead. Hold on
Good
one
point.
second. Irv and then Michael.
Yeah, I don't understand the Midianites and the other group that took them to Egypt. I don't understand. Is it just that? They sold them to somebody who resold them?
And then Potiphar took him in as a personal slave within his home.
Yeah, I remember my daughter did the show, the Broadway show. I saw it so many times. I got a little history with it, but I always got confused of who did the selling. I mean, I know the brothers sold them, but the Midianites and then some other group took them to Egypt. That was always confusing.
Yeah, I mean, they sold them to people on the road.
Yeah, okay.
I believe that shoe salesmen wrote all these packages, a passage, because they're constantly buying sandals for people, and they even list the price. So what more can we wonder about who wrote them?
There's another commentary based on the sandals. And
Even
this is
more.
again from Fishbane's book, which is just a really great commentary on Haftarah. It says, and the needy for a pair of sandals. This clause is stylistically linked to the preceding one. The issue is sale. Only now the needy are sold for the price of sandals. Once more, the charge seems to be some type of corruption. Sandals seems to be a hyperbole contrasting silver in the preceding clause. Some interpreters take the term literally, since sandals were used as probative instrumental units in legal context to validate arrangements by circumventing legal obstacles. So it's saying maybe these sandals were actually for a specific purpose, or maybe it's just showing the sharp contrast. So there's all sorts of different pieces that are brought into this text that might not necessarily meet the eye. But the underlying message of it here, I think, is that there are mistakes that we might make, and God will bring us back and God will forgive us. But there is a limit to God's forgiveness. We can go beyond, beyond that trust. We can break it so deeply that it cannot be fixed. And that's the X+1. It's saying, don't cross that boundary. Don't test God too much. Try to get this figured out. We need to be moral. Any other comments or thoughts on this? Oh, I put the text back here. I forgot I did that.
So
This is the same text we looked at.
can X be any number, or is there a limit? And are the X's all kind of like the same, and then the +1 is the one the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak, or the X+1 or all this? I don't know.
X+1 is used in different with different numbers. I would have to go back to all of the examples of that, which I didn't bring in here. But 3 is also a really important number, and 3 shows up in Amos in different places. So another thing that I didn't list here, and this is in part from these verses, is that Amos lists 7 specific sins. So then he ends up taking the 3 and adding 4, and there's a whole thing about how he adds different numbers together and almost likes doing little mathematical things. But X+1, I believe it sometimes occurs with like 4 or 5 or 6 as well. It's just saying one more. Yeah, Steve, go ahead.
No, I'm
Oh, I
sorry.
thought you were holding your hand.
I was
Sorry.
scratching my head.
Is there anyone else that I'm missing?
Yep.
Okay. One more little piece in here. Sorry, Rabbi Catherine, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out, they've changed this system slightly. I'm going back to verse 7. This is the one where the father and son go to the same girl and thereby profane my holy name, that it's so egregious and so obvious that this is like the one that breaks the camel's back. I mean, I came up with about 5 or 6 different things from the old part of the Testament. You know, wife turned to salt, you know, and then you have the angels. Remember when the angels go to knock on the door of the family, or they say, oh, we want the men to come in. We want to have our that every time something like that is egregiously against God, especially in the way that people treat each other, that maybe that this indicates that is God's tripping point. When you're going to make me look bad, you've broken all my rules, you flaunt my rules, you know, basically you trash my rules, that is God's breaking point. And that's what, when I see the father and the son with the same woman, I mean, that's like going back to Tamar.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's part of the reason that is this week's Haftarah. Thank you. There is one other text here that also speaks to this X+1 thing, and this is from the Talmud Bavli. So it was taught in a Baraita, that's basically a commentary based on, that Rabbi Yossi ben Bar Yehuda says, when a person commits a transgression, the first time he's forgiven, the second time he's forgiven, the third time he's forgiven, but the fourth time he is not forgiven. As it is stated, thus said the Eternal, for 3 transgressions of Israel, but for 4 I will not reverse it. And it's quoting our Amos text that we just read. All these things does God do twice or 3 times with the man? So it's just kind of cementing that with Talmud. Let's go a little bit further into our text, starting with Amos 9. Would anyone like to read some of this?
I'll read it.
Thank you, Michael.
Yet I destroyed the Amorite before them, whose stature was like the cedars, and who was stout as the oak, destroying his boughs above and his trunk below. And I brought you up from the land of Egypt and led you through the wilderness 40 years to possess the land of the Amorite. And I raised up prophets from among your sons and Nazarites from among your young men. Is that not so, O people of Israel, says the Lord? Well,
Just a little bit. Oh, there's actually more than a little bit left.
But you made the Nazarites drink wine and ordered the prophets not to prophecy. Ah, I will slow your movements as a wagon is slowed when it is full of cut grain. Flight shall flail the swift. The strong shall find no strength, and the warrior shall not save his life. The bowman shall not hold his ground, and the fleet-footed shall not escape, nor the horseman save his life. Even the most stout-hearted warrior shall run away unarmed that day, declares the Lord.
Okay, so what is Amos trying to get apart with this lengthy text here?
Even after everything God has done for them, they're still having sin.
So they're not learning. It's frustration.
Well, not only that, it's like watching a kid grow up and they get to that age where they want to just push against everything that you say and everything they've been taught. And God is kind of saying, when you have the Nazarites drink wine and you ordered prophets not to prophesy. It's like you got a bunch of people drunk and then you wipe out everybody that is my chosen person for continuing what I want to have, you just went too far. You know, that's what we say, you know, so go live someplace else and see how that goes.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And I want to kind of pick this apart a little bit because it does mention specific groups and it mentions Egypt, for example, and all of these are highly symbolic, as you were pointing to, Rabbi Catherine, right? We know that he has a knowledge of Jewish institutions by the way in which he's talking about them within this text, right? Let's look at the reference to Egypt first, and then we're going to get to the Nazarites and the prophets as well. But why do you think he starts talking about Egypt here?
Oh my God, of course. We were slaves.
I was going to say,
What does that have to do with anything? Like, why is that important to acknowledge here?
Well, after we were rescued, we made a covenant at Sinai with God. So that happened after Egypt. That was part of the whole story. So we have a covenant, which apparently we're not keeping up our end very well.
And that's really important, what you're saying, Jessica. It's going to come up again in the text that we're going to get to right after this one. Of, hey, I did this for you. We made this pact with one another. I'm holding up my end. What are you doing? Is there anything else here?
I was going to say it points to the power of God. Like, you're nothing without me. You would not be the people that you are if it wasn't for that pivotal moment when I stepped into history and pulled you out of Egypt. I gave you a prophet to lead you across the desert. And for 40 years, I worked with you to get your, ready to be a people that could run a nation, right? So a reminder of everything that they are, they owe to God.
Great. So it's going back to anava. It's going back to humility again, like Obadiah was teaching us last week.
And the refrigerator was delivered on time.
Yes, of course.
All right. That's right.
Jay,
but isn't this the lesson for all of us up to and including this day and beyond, that in a sense, we're nothing without God, and God is within each and every one of us.
Absolutely.
That's my lesson.
Yeah,
And
Jay, go ahead.
And the refrigerator.
Sorry, Michael. Yes, and the refrigerator.
Well, I wanted to go at this a little differently. What I see here is bringing back up the idea of Egypt, which was probably our lowest point in life at this time, where we were slaves and we didn't have freedom and we were at our lowest point. And even now, I think Amos is trying to say, as bad as things are right now, nothing can be as bad as we were in the land of Egypt and going through the wilderness these 40 years.
Oops. Yeah. I mean, at this point in history, things were not super bad for the Jewish people at this point. Remember, like, the Assyrian army is no longer as powerful. They're actually filling a void. Things are going a little bit better for the Israelites, both in the northern and southern kingdom, but they're losing sight of what's important. And that message of, there always are hard times. And when that happens, God's going to be there for us, but let's not create them, please, right? That's an important one.
So what is it? People used to say you got too big for your britches. Now, you think you can do it, you think you can do it. And yes, I have helped. And yes, I have helped. But there is a limit and you just reached it.
Yes, absolutely. So that's such an important thing. And Egypt is going to come back for exactly that reason, exactly why Jessica was talking about earlier before. And then we come to this idea of the Nazarites. So does everyone have familiarity with who the Nazarites were?
Yes.
There might be a little bit of yes, a little bit of no. Sorry, Irv, go ahead.
That's about what we think of the Mormons today.
I see, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I brought in
what I'm saying is they're very conservative and they very devout and they don't drink and they don't do these things that they're tempting them to do.
Oh,
They
Yeah,
don't cut their hair.
yeah.
right, exactly. So Nazarites are people who make a vow to God. They choose to make a
Mhm.
vow to God in order to remain pure for God. They don't cut their hair, they don't drink, they don't go near a dead body. There's all sorts of things that they do in order to stay pure for God.
Mhm.
And so if we understand this context as it appears in the book of Numbers, right, about the Nazarite, then when we look back at our text here,
Mhm.
and it says, you made the Nazarites drink wine.
Right.
Huh, that's a little bit egregious, isn't it?
It's you force them to break a vow that they made with me.
Yeah, and you're making them impure by having
Mhm.
them do this.
Mhm. And as
But
far,
it sounds like a group of a society that's now had it pretty good for a while. Coming out of Egypt, they were it wasn't that good, and they had this what I call slave psychology set in and said we had it better off in Egypt than we got it right now. You know, that kind of thinking. But this is a period of time now where things are going a little bit better. Everything's okay. And like a lot of people with free will, they're going to be well. We don't need God that much, you know. We'll just have fun, or we'll live a different lifestyle. Because when they met the Greeks, it almost went down that way too. I mean, so anyway, that's my take on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, losing sight of what actually is really important. Just because things are going well doesn't mean you should do whatever you want, right? It's all the more important that we hold on to our deepest values.
We got a little bit of that in the Jewish community in America. I mean, there was so many people assimilated and no longer belong to any Jewish organizations, for one thing. When I lived in Orange County, we had 100,000, estimated 100,000 Jews didn't belong to any Jewish organization. We were kind of like in the closet. And they came from communities where everybody belonged to at least something. And they just kind of disappeared into the California lifestyle or whatever it was. And we did some studying on that and we never came to any conclusion.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that I see why you use that example. I think it's a little bit complicated just because in every generation, Judaism is a little different. And so what one generation considers to be like the important thing to join, the next generation, they might be joiners, but they join something slightly different. And so it's a little bit apples and oranges, but you're right. Like this commitment to Jewish life and Jewish peoplehood is something that needs to be a consistent commitment, whether we're doing really well or we're having a hard time. That point is very valid.
I was just thinking, as I usually do, that it's all about being grateful for having our lives here today and back then, you know, thousands of years ago. And it all happens with God's help in the sense. And, you know, like God saying, hey, I did this for you. I did that for you. I led you out of Egypt. But look at what you're doing now. Look what you did to the Nazarites and so on. And it's shameful for them who did that, and they should be grateful for their freedom from slavery and for the lives that they were living then.
It's the measure of personal responsibility.
Or lack thereof.
Absolutely, right? How much are we taking responsibility for one another and of our commitment to God? Yeah. And when we look at this text too, where it brings up the prophets, and that's kind of interesting in a book that's written by a prophet, right? Like, why do you think it's employing the prophets here? Order the prophets not to prophecy.
Order the prophets not to pass on what God has told them.
Well,
Is there a different context in the Hebrew for the word prophet or prophecy? Could it be misconstrued in the English
I'd be more than happy to look at the Hebrew with you. So right here,
Yeah.
Tinavu, if you look at this, it's the exact same root in Hebrew as ha-nevi'im. Nevi'im are prophets.
Mhm.
You see that?
And prophet is interpreted, is understood as interpreting God's word. Or
Yes.
God's, okay, I got it. Thank you.
Oh,
Yeah. And we might not resonate with us. That might not feel, like exactly what we as individuals believe for all of us, and that's okay. But that is what the Hebrew is indicating.
It opens the door for charlatans and false prophets and
We've had a lot of them over the years.
Yes, we have had a lot of them over the years, and there is a lot written about how you tell a false prophet from a true one. One of the big key things being that a true prophet doesn't want to be one, whereas a false prophet does.
that's funny.
That's funny.
And Sakata.
Hi, Cornelia. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, that line, order the prophets not to prophesy, that reminds me, I remember when Facebook agreed, probably with Donald Trump, that they would not, wait a minute, how did it go? That they would not require fact checking of political ads. So I mean, if you think of a prophet as a truth checker or someone who's going to tell the truth and people trying to get away from the truth, you can see that parallel.
Yeah, I mean, that brings in totally different dynamics that are worthy of talking about, but weren't necessarily apparent as much at this time, right?
But yeah, obviously, but I mean, certainly the newspapers and the news and fact checking and so forth. But is it the idea about prophets that they're going to be there telling the truth, and that's why we don't want them to prophesy?
Well, I mean, being a prophet, being a prophet is it's an awful job. Because you have to tell the truth and you have to say things that people don't want to hear because you're asking people to change and saying God's going to hold you accountable if you don't, right? Like, it's a dreadful job. There's a reason Jonah was running away, right?
Yep.
Okay, that was Nazarite's vow. Okay, I'm going to bring us a little further just because I'm mindful of the time right now. And we only have a few verses left. There's not too many. So it says, hear this word, O people Israel, that the Eternal has spoken concerning you, concerning the whole family that I brought up from the land of Egypt. You alone have I singled out of all the families of the earth. That is why I will call you to account for your iniquities. So it's kind of interesting language that's being used here, right? We have Egypt being brought in again. And this time in a slightly different context, along with this line, of all the families of the earth, you alone have I singled out. Why do you think Amos is using this kind of language here?
Chosen. The chosen people.
Well, I think he's being serious. I mean, this warning is serious. And, I mean, what an incredible blessing to be chosen to be God's people. And, if we don't meet up to this, we can lose that. I mean, it's a warning. And it's a very strong warning. It's a reminder of everything God has done for his chosen people.
Mm-hmm.
It's that thing you just said. A true prophet doesn't really want to be one. And here we are, labeled the true prophets. It says right here, you are my people. It reminds me of my father, who was a captain in the army, used to say, rank hath its responsibilities, rank hath its privileges, and rank hath its responsibilities. So a lot of times you want the, oh yeah, you're great, but you do not want what you have to what you have to hold on to, what your responsibility is for not just you, but all the other people you stand for and are involved with.
You know
So is
that,
it, oh, I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
So is it the human flaw of envy that is behind anti-Semitism, among other things, that we are the chosen people and others who are not envy us, and that is why we have had hundreds, if not thousands of years of anti-Semitism?
I mean, I don't think so. I mean, personally, I'm not a scholar in this area, right? I do think that the idea of someone saying, I am the chosen people, could definitely be met and has been met with resentment.
Okay,
But anti-Semitism exists because we are a small enough group that we can be taken advantage of and have been taken advantage of, that we could be blamed for things, but we're strong enough that people believe that we have more control than we have. Like, it's very, 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 very complicated. But this idea of chosenness is definitely one element of things that has created problems for us. Yeah, Cornelia.
Well, I just sort of wanted to agree with Michael, because I can see how using that word, the Jews using it for so many years and publicly, could arouse people's enmity, even though maybe it's often used in the context of rebuking the Jews and saying, well, hey, you're not acting like the chosen people at all.
Right.
So it's kind of paradoxical, but I agree that it seems to me that that concept that's held strongly among a people could arouse anger, envy from an outside group, misunderstanding.
Yeah, and even this word, right? The word here for singled out is yadati. And that is a word of relationship. It's a word of like, I have the sacred, intimate relationship with you as a people. That could also arouse kind of an envy.
But Jews are not choosing to call themselves the chosen people. The Old Testament is saying that God, the Lord, is making that choice, which makes it even more serious.
To Michael's point, I don't know. I have many Jewish friends, and I don't know a single one that walks around telling me they're the chosen people. Exactly. Nobody walks around saying I'm the chosen people. But back to the reading where it says, that is why I will call you to account for all your inequities. I think God sets a really high bar, because you are his chosen people. And it's just like, a parent expects a child to reflect certain characteristics, like you're representing me, my family, and what have you. And when we don't, it brings a lot of disappointment, right? So I can hear that in the voice that's there. I've given you all this, I've set these examples, I saved you, I blah, blah, blah. And yet, look at the state that you're in. And so that's what the prophet is reminding them, because, it's very easy. Usually the first generation remembers everything, and by the second or the third, it's all out the window, and they're like, well, why are we even doing this? And and so that's where the reminder is. Everything you have, this beautiful country I've given you, you didn't earn, I gave it to you.
Yeah, Steve, did you want to say something now?
The prophet Tevye the milkman said, perhaps next time you could choose somebody else.
Right. It's a lot of responsibility we're taking on, and look at everything that comes with it.
Yeah, it's like you want to have, it's like, particularly if you're looking in and you are not the Jewish people, you say, well, look at all this great stuff that they get. And you don't hear about there are consequences if you do not respect and fulfill your responsibility. And those are not fun. Again, if you look back on our past, you cannot not see that.
That's absolutely true.
And it's geographical too. I've had the pleasure and the displeasure of living in different parts of the country where I would probably be the only Jewish person at the place of work, the only Jewish family in the neighborhood, or even in a large part of the city. And also I've lived in, grew up in Brooklyn, which is 2,400,000 Jews. Of course, my wife says, with all those Jews, I picked a poor one. But so where you lived your life in the different societies you lived in also comes, because I in the South, I had a chip on my shoulder, a big chip on my shoulder, especially when it came Christmas time. And I came up with some retorts that I've been, but Catherine has shamed me about, so I don't use them anymore. But it's so you can, if you're a lonely Jew or among a few, you automatically go to, well, you're doing that to me because I'm Jewish. And I'm sure I'm sure other races and other minorities feel the same thing. The first thing, I'm being discriminated upon because of this, when it may or may not be true. But it's so that was that chip on my shoulder, and I had to, Rabbi talked me out of that chip, and I've been glad ever since.
Good.
Yeah, I think that a lot of us have something to add to that conversation. Looking at the time, I'm just going to bring us back to this final verse from Amos here, this final little section, which is a series of rhetorical questions is how it ends, which I think is actually really interesting. So it says, can two walk together without having met? Does a lion roar in the forest when he has no prey? Does a great beast let out a cry from its den without having made a capture? Does a bird drop on the ground in a trap with no snare there? Does a trap spring forward from the ground unless it caught something? When a ram's horn is sounded in a town, do the people not take alarm? Can misfortune come to a town if the Eternal has not caused it? Indeed, my God does nothing without having revealed God's purpose to God's servants, the prophets. A lion has roared, but who can hear? My eternal God has spoken, but who can prophesy? So what do you make of these final verses of the Haftarah? Why does it include all of these rhetorical questions? What message is it trying to get across?
I think the author wants to get your attention and have you think about what you're doing and living and what it's all about. And what is your personal responsibility in this situation?
Well,
It keeps reminding you if something happens, something causes everything to happen. You can't just say it was out of nowhere. An interesting combination.
Yeah, I would just say that yeah, I take away that he's while life is good during that time, everybody's it seems like the economy's good and people have everything they need, but there is a big problem that he sees. He's just a shepherd, right? He's just a and he's saying this voice of prophecy isn't coming because everything's good. We're missing the mark, and you need to listen.
Right, because not everyone had what they needed, right? As a society, things were going well, but there were people who had a lot, and there were people who barely had anything.
And they were being abused and sold into slavery and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So part of the message here, as we just heard, right, is we all believe ourselves to be good people, and we try to do the right thing. But maybe at moments where no one sees us, maybe we're not quite doing the right thing. And I think that the message in here is God's always watching. Our actions always have implications. And so let's do our very best. Let's not take for granted that God will always forgive us because we have a responsibility.
Mhm.
Let's take it seriously.
Mhm.
Any other final comments or thoughts here before we close out our Haftarah study?
Well, as a group, we are a small group and probably getting smaller, I think, but we still have a loud voice. And as a group, I think we're more philanthropic and we're not doing it to buy our way into heaven. I mean, we're doing it for the right reasons. So I'm very proud of our group. I'm very proud to be part of it. Proud to be part of the synagogue and be proud of be part of this group who studies every week to become just a little bit better.
Right. I don't think that Amos is necessarily speaking to the people in this room right now, right?
Exactly.
But it's a good reminder of just like the sacred privilege that we're given, the sacred responsibility, and how much our actions can have an impact. Well, thank you so much for joining in conversation around all of these texts. I know that the prophets kind of bring us on a whirlwind of emotions every week. They're very, very good at that. And next week, we're going to be going to the Book of Kings as we study that Haftarah. So I look forward to doing that with you then. And next week's portion is a story that some of us might be familiar with, but we might not know where it came from originally. So I look forward to studying that with you next Thursday. All right. Bye, everyone. Shabbat Shalom and happy Hanukkah.
Bye-bye.
Shabbat shalom. Bye.
Shabbat shalom.